My name is Clara Mitchell. I am 34 years old, and on the day I finally thought I had beaten cancer and found love, my own sister ripped the wig from my head in front of everyone. The laughter, the stares, the humiliation cut deeper than the disease ever had. But what none of them expected was that minutes later my groom would rise, take the clippers, and do something that silenced the entire hall. The summer sun spilled across the mountains as light poured through the tall windows of the Aspen Lodge in Colorado. My heart pounded so loudly, it felt like the sound might push through the heavy oak doors in front of me. I rubbed my damp palms against the satin of my dress, but it did little to calm me. Beside me, Lily's small hand clutched mine with a grip that carried both fear and love. She looked up, her brown eyes steady, and whispered that I looked beautiful. Her voice trembled as if she was trying to convince herself as much as me. Maggie crouched at my side, adjusting the hem of my gown. She gave me a reassuring smile and said to breathe. Her confidence was a rope I held onto in that moment. Still, the air felt heavy, and behind my smile, I could feel my chest tighten. For a second, I slipped back in time to 2 years earlier, when hospital lights glared into my eyes and chemo burned through my veins. I remembered staring at my reflection, bald and fragile, wondering if I would ever feel whole again. The wig I wore today was not just hair. It was proof that I had survived, that I had walked out of those halls and built a life for myself and for Lily. I touched the edge of it carefully, reminding myself that it symbolized victory, not shame. Yet under that strength was an uneasiness I could not shake. Through the crack of the door, I caught sight of my parents seated near the front. My mother, Eleanor, leaned toward a guest, her lips tight, as she whispered something. Then her eyes flicked toward me with that same cool distance I had felt my entire life. My father, Charles, sat stiff, his face unreadable, but when our eyes met, he quickly looked away as if I wasn't even there. Then I saw her. Amanda, my younger sister. Her hair styled perfectly, her dress sparkling as though she were the one being celebrated. She stood near the aisle, her smile wide and gleaming, but her eyes narrowed when they found me. In that single look, there was something sharper than joy. It felt like a warning. I drew in a breath and forced myself to focus on the present. The music from the string quartet rose beyond the doors. The ushers began moving, signaling it was almost my turn. I caught Jason Hall, my colleague from the community health program, sitting a few rows back. He glanced over his shoulder, found me, and nodded slowly. His calm expression steadied me in a way that words could not. At least someone here saw me as I truly was. Maggie touched my arm, whispering that it was time. Lily straightened her shoulders, her grip never loosening on my hand. For an instant, I thought of all the years we had faced together, just the two of us scraping by, proving that we were enough. I lifted my chin as the doors began to open. The room beyond was filled with roses, polished wood, and hundreds of eyes waiting. As I stepped into the light, every face turned toward me. My pulse raced beneath the satin of my dress. The sound of the music swelled, but it could not drown out the faint sound of a laugh. My eyes shifted and landed on Amanda. She tilted her head, her lips curling into a smile that carried no warmth. She lifted her hand slightly like a secret wave, only for me, her expression mocking. The smile froze on my face, my stomach twisting. Something inside me whispered that this day meant to be filled with love was about to change. I kept walking, each step echoing on the wooden floor, but my mind clung to Amanda's look, that promise hidden behind her smile. It was not over. It was only beginning. My mother leaned toward me as I passed her row, her voice sharp and hushed enough for only me to hear. "This is Amanda's day. Do not cause a scene." The words struck harder than the music swelling in the background. I felt them dig into an old wound that had never healed. I thought of 2016 when Grandma passed away and left a modest inheritance. Everyone whispered that it would be divided fairly, that it might help me as a single mother. But somehow the documents were altered, and everything shifted into Amanda's name. I had stood there in silence as my parents told me I would be fine on my own, that I was the strong one. That strength had become the excuse for every slight, every dismissal, every time they placed Amanda on a pedestal while I learned to survive. I walked forward slowly, my arm steadying Lily at my side. but inside I felt the familiar burn of injustice. My life had been built brick by brick without their support. Long nights of working school forms filled out alone, doctor's appointments managed with no one else in the waiting room. I wanted to believe I had buried those resentments, but my mother's words had pulled them back into the light. Amanda moved across the aisle, her perfume drifting toward me as she leaned in close while guests shifted in their seats. Her whisper brushed my ear laced with poison. "Tonight, you will remember forever." A chill ran down my spine, and I caught myself gripping Lily's hand too tightly. I loosened my hold, forcing a smile for her sake, but my chest tightened. The officiant cleared his throat, and the music shifted, but my mind was spinning. I glanced toward Jason and saw him watching, his eyes narrowing as if he had sensed something. Maggie leaned forward from her place near the bridesmaids, mouthing a quick, "Are you okay?" I gave the smallest nod, unwilling to let Amanda see me falter. My mother's gaze followed me down the aisle, her lips pressed thin. I could almost hear her voice echoing, telling me not to embarrass the family, not to break the illusion of harmony. My father sat stiffly, his hands folded, his jaw clenched tight. Neither of them smiled at me. Their loyalty had always been clear. The weight of it pressed against me as the ceremony began. The officiant's words blurred the murmur of guests like waves in the distance. All I could think about was Amanda's smirk, the way her words promised something more, something waiting to unravel the fragile peace of this day. Lily tugged my arm gently and whispered that my hands were shaking. I swallowed hard, looked down at her brave little face, and forced another smile. She deserved joy today, not shadows from the past. Yet the truth clawed at me, telling me that the past was not finished, that it was about to step into the light with all of us. The vows had barely begun when I felt Amanda's eyes fixed on me again, her smirk never fading. It was as if she was waiting for her moment, waiting for me to stumble so she could strike. And in that instant, I knew the storm I had feared was not just in my head. It was coming, and it was coming soon. Amanda moved faster than I could react. One second she was smiling at the guests, the next she was right in front of me, her hand darting up and ripping the wig from my head. Gasps tore through the crowded room as the music collapsed into silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the sound of whispers and muffled laughter filled the air, like a wave rushing from every corner. Phones lifted, screens glinting, recording every second. Amanda dangled the wig in her hand, and her voice cut sharp, telling me it never made me beautiful. Her words sliced deeper than the stairs, now pinning me in place. My body went cold, my face burning hot. I felt naked, exposed in a way I never had before. I saw my mother's lips tighten, her eyes hard with disapproval. She hissed at me not to ruin the day. My father looked down at his shoes, unwilling to meet my eyes, unwilling to see me stripped like this. My knees trembled, but I stood frozen, the sound of Lily's small gasp stabbing me harder than all the rest. She clutched my dress, her fingers trembling, hiding her face from the lights and the laughter. Then a strong voice rose from the front rows. Karen Brooks, a family friend and pediatrician, stood with her arms folded. Her words echoed across the hall. "This is assault." The whispers dimmed for a moment, all eyes swinging toward her, before scattering again in a new storm of murmurs. Maggie was suddenly at my side, her body shielding me as she pulled a shawl from her shoulders and wrapped it over my head. She whispered to hold still, that she had me. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear her. Across the aisle, Jason Hall held up his phone, his jaw tight. And when our eyes met, he gave me a short nod. A buzz in my palm told me a message had come through. "If you need me, I will stand as a witness." I clutched the phone, feeling my throat close around the words I could not say. Amanda tossed the wig onto a chair with a smirk as if the show was over, and she had won. Some guests shook their heads in disbelief, others whispered behind their hands. I heard the metallic click of a camera, the flash capturing my humiliation for eternity. I tried to breathe, but every inhale was sharp, each exhale unsteady. My dignity felt like it had been peeled away in front of everyone I knew. I could taste the bitterness of shame, mixed with rage rising inside me. Eleanor hissed again from her seat, her voice colder this time, telling me to stay calm, to not make a bigger scene. as if my silence could erase what had just been done, as if my shame was less important than her idea of family pride. Lily tugged harder at me, her voice breaking, asking if we could go home. My hands shook as I pulled her close, kissing the top of her head, promising quietly that I was here, that nothing would hurt her. But inside, I was unraveling each stare from the crowd. Another cut. The officiant stood frozen with his book in hand, caught between duty and the chaos unraveling in front of him. No one moved to remove Amanda, no one told her to leave. For a moment it felt like the entire hall was conspiring to watch me fall. I steadied my shoulders under Maggie's shawl, forcing my feet to stay planted. I would not let Amanda see me run. Not here, not now. But inside, I knew something had broken open, something that would not be put back together. The laughter, the whispers, the betrayal in my parents' eyes, the sting of Amanda's smirk still hanging in the air. All of it pressed into me until I knew this was no longer just about a wig. This was about everything they had ever taken from me, and it had only just begun. Maggie wrapped her arm around me and guided me out of the hall, her body shielding me from the stairs and phones still raised. We slipped into the small preparation room behind the stage, the heavy door closing with a thud that finally cut off the noise of the crowd. She pulled a soft shawl from her bag and draped it carefully over my head, her hands gentle as if she were handling something fragile. Lily burst into tears, her small body shaking as she pressed against me. I crouched down, holding her tight, whispering that it was all right, even though my own tears threatened to spill. The door opened again, and Cole Harper, the lodge's manager, stepped in with a clipboard. His expression was grave, but steady, as he said that the cameras in the hall had captured everything. He assured me an incident report would be filed immediately, and that I would have a copy by the end of the night. Relief and dread collided in my chest. Proof meant power, but it also meant there was no undoing what had just happened. Karen entered behind him, her face stern. She signed her name as a witness, speaking firmly that what she saw was unacceptable. Jason appeared moments later, his phone in hand. He showed me a message he had already sent to his office, time-stamped with the moment Amanda pulled the wig from my head. He promised that if I needed official documentation, it would be ready. My hands trembled as I took the pen Cole offered. I scrawled my name under the report, whispering through clenched teeth that this was not a joke. As the ink dried, the door creaked open once more, and my mother stepped in. Eleanor's eyes darted to Lily, then to me before fixing on the clipboard in Cole's hand. Her voice was sharp, clipped with frustration. She said I needed to let this go, that making it official would shame the family and ruin the celebration. My chest tightened as her words echoed the same message I had heard all my life. Keep quiet. Endure. Do not embarrass us. I stood straighter, adjusting the shawl around my head, and looked her square in the eye. My voice was low but steady, as I told her that everything was already recorded, that witnesses had signed, that nothing could be erased. She flinched, just slightly, at the certainty in my tone. Behind me, Lily sniffled, clutching Maggie's hand now. Jason's phone buzzed again, and he nodded at me, a silent reminder that he had my back. Cole gathered his clipboard and promised to return with copies for me later. Karen stayed close, her presence a wall between me and the weight of my mother's disappointment. Eleanor shook her head, muttering that I was making a mistake, but she backed toward the door when she realized no one in the room was on her side. Her heels clicked against the floor as she left the silence she left behind, heavy but freeing. I exhaled for the first time since Amanda's attack, my chest loosening as if air was finally returning. I brushed a tear from Lily's cheek and told her she was safe, though my hands were still shaking. Maggie squeezed my arm, her eyes saying what words could not. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that the worst was behind me, that the evidence would protect me, that the humiliation would end here. But deep inside, I knew Amanda was not finished. She had promised I would remember tonight forever, and she always kept her promises in the cruelest ways. I stepped back into the hall, my shawl still pulled tight around my head, and the buzz of voices hit me like a wave. Some faces turned away quickly, others stared with open curiosity, and a few looked at me with something close to pity. My father was the first to speak, his voice sharp but quiet enough to carry weight. He told me to let it go, that this could be handled after the ceremony. His words were less a request than a command, the same tone he had used all my life whenever he wanted me to disappear into silence. Amanda stood a few steps behind him, her expression soft and contrite for the audience, but her eyes still glittered with victory. She lifted her shoulders and said it was just a joke, that I was overreacting. The hypocrisy made my stomach churn. I thought of the inheritance the day I learned that my grandmother's will had been rewritten without my knowledge. Everything moved into Amanda's name. It was never about love or fairness. It had always been about making sure she came first. Jason moved closer, his voice carrying across the front rows. He said clearly that this was not a small matter, that what had happened was an offense. His stance was strong, and the room shifted slightly as people heard the authority in his words. Murmurs rippled through the guests. One woman near the back whispered loudly enough for me to hear that this family was toxic. Another man shook his head, saying he had never seen anything so cruel. I could feel my pulse rising, the shame turning into heat that surged through me. My mother hissed again from her seat, urging me to stay calm, to think of the family's image. I looked at her, then at the guests, and felt something inside me snap. I raised my voice steadier than I expected, telling them all that they could choose silence if they wanted, but I would not. My words rang out over the hush, and for the first time, the air seemed to shift in my direction. Some eyes met mine with quiet respect. Others slid away, unwilling to be involved. A line had been drawn without anyone saying it out loud. Amanda stood stiff, her smile faltering, the mask of innocence beginning to crack, as she realized not everyone believed her performance. The officiant cleared his throat, trying to regain order, but his voice was drowned out by the swell of divided whispers. Guests leaned into one another, debating in hushed tones, some siding with my parents, others shaking their heads in open disapproval. The weight of their judgment no longer pressed only on me. It pressed back toward Amanda, toward the family that had enabled her. Maggie stood firm at my side, Lily clutching her hand now, her small body pressed into Maggie's dress. I touched Lily's shoulder and saw the fear in her eyes, but also the trust. That trust was the anchor that held me upright. Amanda's voice rose again, higher and sharper now, accusing me of trying to ruin her big day. The irony stung, but I said nothing more. I let the silence grow heavy around her, let the stares speak for themselves. In that silence, with the hall split into those who saw the truth and those who refused to, I realized nothing would ever return to the way it had been. This was no longer a private feud hidden inside family walls. It was now public, carved into the memory of everyone who had witnessed it, and the consequences were only beginning to unfold. David rose from his chair before anyone else could speak. The sound of it scraped against the wooden floor and silenced the room more effectively than the officiant's gavel could have. He crossed the space between us with measured steps, his eyes fixed not on Amanda or my parents, but on me. When he reached me, he took my trembling hand, and his voice carried clear across every row. "No one has the right to humiliate my wife." The word wife cut through me sharp and steady, stronger than anything I could have said. Gasps rustled through the crowd, but David did not pause. He guided me toward the side door that led to the groom's preparation room. My knees felt unsteady, yet his grip never wavered. Inside the small room, he asked one of the staff for clippers kept in a drawer for last-minute grooming. The man hesitated, but David's calm nod was enough. The buzzing hum filled the space, and I realized what he intended. I told him he did not have to, my voice breaking, but he only smiled faintly. "I stand with you," he said, and before I could argue, he ran the clippers through his hair. Thick locks fell to the floor, scattering across the tile, like proof of his promise. In minutes, his head was bare, his reflection unrecognizable, but radiant with conviction. My hands shook as I reached out, touching the newly shorn skin, tears blurring my vision. He placed the clippers down and laced his fingers with mine. Together we stepped back into the hall. The silence was deafening. Every guest turned, eyes wide, mouths parted. No one moved. No one even breathed. David lifted our joined hands, his voice steady and full. "If hair is the reason she is mocked, then we will wear this together." The words landed heavy, unshakable, forcing the room to confront itself. A woman in the front dabbed her eyes. Another man dropped his phone into his lap. The air shifted from cruel curiosity to something softer, almost reverent. I felt my shame peel away with every tear I saw in the faces of strangers. Amanda stood near the aisle, her complexion drained of color. Her lips pressed together, searching for something to say. But nothing came. The confidence that had fueled her cruelty shrank in the silence. My parents sat frozen, my mother clutching her purse, my father staring at the floor as if he could vanish into it. The officiant cleared his throat again, but his words trembled, barely audible. It was David's declaration that filled the hall, not the ceremony, not the vows yet to come. For the first time, I felt the weight shift entirely. The room was no longer judging me. It was bowing in a quiet way to a truth it could not deny. Lily rushed forward and threw her arms around David's waist, whispering that he looked like a superhero. Laughter rippled, gently breaking the tension, without mockery warming the air that had been so cold minutes before. I held on to him tighter, grateful beyond words. Yet as I glanced across the room, past the softened faces and damp eyes, I saw Amanda still staring at me, with something sharper than shame. It was not surrender. It was fury, simmering beneath the silence, and I knew she was already planning what to do next. The room no longer belonged to her. Guests who had once leaned in to laugh at her side now pulled away, shifting their chairs, avoiding her eyes. I saw one couple set down their champagne glasses and whisper before moving to another table entirely. The photographer who had been circling for candid shots lowered his camera and turned toward the opposite side of the hall, deliberately cutting Amanda from his frame. Cole Harper, the venue manager, approached me quietly and handed over his phone so I could read the draft of the incident report. He said he had already emailed a copy to my address, copied Jason and Karen for verification. My hands shook as I scrolled through the lines, relief tightening my throat. Proof was now official, undeniable. Jason stepped over and confirmed that his office had received the email that timestamps were preserved. Karen gave me a short nod of reassurance, her calm presence making me breathe easier. A woman who had laughed earlier came forward with tears in her eyes, stammering an apology, saying she had not understood the cruelty until she saw David stand by me. Her husband placed a hand on her shoulder and nodded at me, ashamed. Amanda stood rigid near the aisle, her face pale and strained. She pulled her phone from her clutch and glanced at the screen. Her lips parted as if the message she had just received had drained the last of her composure. I caught the glow of the text as she turned away, and though I could not see it all, I knew the meaning. Her boyfriend, the man she had boasted about in secret, had ended things after hearing what happened. Word had already spread beyond these walls. My parents tried to close the gap with excuses. Eleanor called out that it had only been a misunderstanding, that families had disagreements, that no one should take it too seriously. Charles muttered that the day should not be ruined by one small mistake. Their voices carried little weight. People turned their backs, politely refusing to engage. The spell that had once protected Amanda was broken. Amanda's shoulders began to shake, her eyes darting from face to face as if begging for someone to stand with her. No one moved. She dropped her phone, caught it again, then stumbled toward the exit. A harsh sob tore from her throat as she pushed through the doors, her heels echoing against the stone corridor. The hall exhaled in unison, the sound heavy with finality. I watched her retreating figure disappear and felt something loosen inside me. It was not triumph. It was not revenge. It was the weight of years lifting a release I had never believed would come. I sank into my chair, Maggie beside me. Lily pressed against my arm. David's hand was warm around mine, grounding me. For the first time that day, I let myself breathe deeply. Justice had not needed me to scream or fight. It had found its way here on its own, and it had settled like a verdict everyone had witnessed. The officiant cleared his throat gently, waiting for a cue to resume. I looked around the hall, saw eyes still damp, shoulders still tense, and realized that what happened could not simply be swept away. It had already become a story, one that would live far beyond these walls. And as the quiet settled, I knew that my parents had not given up, that Amanda's tears would not be the end of it. They would try to salvage their pride, and their next move was already looming. The ceremony resumed, though it felt nothing like the one I had imagined when I first walked through those doors. The air was different now, heavy with the memory of what had happened, but lighter, in a way I could not fully explain. Guests who had once looked at me with curiosity or pity now held their gazes steady, their expressions softened with respect. I felt it in their eyes as I stood with David, his hand firm around mine, his head bare, but his heart shining through every gesture. Cole Harper approached quietly, placing a folder into my hand. Inside was the printed report, official and precise, every detail logged with timestamps and signatures. He assured me a digital copy had already been sent to my email, with Jason and Karen copied for record. Jason joined us soon after, his calm presence reminding me that I was not alone. He told me firmly that if I wanted to pursue charges, he would stand with me in court. His words settled into me like a promise of safety, but also a choice I now had the power to make. I turned and saw my parents across the hall. Eleanor's shoulders were stiff, her eyes downcast, but her mouth moving quickly as she whispered to Charles. They were already rewriting the story in their minds, already trying to paint it as something less than what it was. When I approached, Eleanor reached for my arm, telling me not to let this ruin the family forever. Her voice was pleading, but underneath it was the same old command to keep quiet, to protect appearances. I pulled my arm back gently, but firmly. I told her that for now, there would be no contact, no dinners, no visits. I said I needed space for myself and for Lily, and that I was choosing peace over loyalty to their silence. The words hung between us like a line drawn in stone. For the first time, my father looked at me without looking away. His mouth opened as if to speak, but he said nothing. Maggie stood close, Lily at her side, watching carefully. David squeezed my hand, steadying me when my voice trembled. I straightened my shoulders and told my parents that I wished them well, but I would not allow Amanda's cruelty or their indifference to poison my family any longer. I saw Eleanor flinch, saw Charles close his eyes, and then I turned away. The music rose again, gentler this time. Guests applauded softly, some even standing, as David and I walked back down the aisle. Lily skipped slightly between us. Her face finally relaxed, a small smile playing at her lips. The hall that had once been filled with whispers now held only a calm reverence. When we stepped outside, the evening air was cool against my skin. David pulled me close and kissed my temple, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "You are safe now." I looked up at him, at the light catching on his newly shaven head, and for the first time that day, I felt pride flood through me. Not shame, not anger, but pride. As the mountains framed the horizon and the last rays of sunlight stretched across the lodge, I knew our story had already taken root in the minds of everyone who witnessed it. Some would talk about cruelty, others about love, but the truth was simple. We had stood together, and that had changed everything. If you were standing where I stood, would you have stayed silent? Or would you have stood up to protect your dignity? Tell me what you would have done, because your voice matters in stories like these.